I just am so excited to talk to Dr. Sarah Kaiser, who is going to be giving us more info on dev containers and code spaces and optimizing your development environment to do really cool things.
Hey, everybody.
Hey,
great to see you. I feel like I have to join the, you've got like the Batman thing going on. I've got my holiday Christmas sweater or holiday festive sweater. I love collecting these. And
I'm always festive. That's just how I live my life.
But yeah, I never have very many opportunities to wear them. So I am super excited that I had a good reason today.
Today's the day. What we're going to do upon Sarah's request is if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll be bringing them up as Sarah is talking. And that means that Sarah's going to go to the 30-minute mark. And so I'll put a little banner at the bottom of the screen so we don't mess up the recording as well when we're getting close to the end of the 30-minute mark as well. All right. So we'll get out of your way.
So yeah, I am really excited to talk about one of my favorite things today, which is dev containers and code spaces, and kind of share some of the ways, since we're going to be seeing all kinds of really cool demos for all kinds of different projects for deploying on Azure. Just a really nice tool you can kind of have in your back pocket to help you both do the development process, learn new projects, and just kind of make your life as a developer easier. So to kind of introduce myself, I am a developer advocate here at Microsoft, specifically for kind of scientific Python sorts of things. I've been a Pythonista for like 15 or so years, and initially learned Python because I wanted to be lazy and not be in my lab when I was trying to run my physics experiments. So I have Python has been my best friend and development buddy for a long time. When I am not working on Python stuff, though, I do hang out a lot with my dog and play here in Seattle and like playing Final Fantasy things. So let me know if you play Final Fantasy 14. But one of my kind of when I'm working with somebody on a new project, or I'm approaching a new maybe open source project, like kind of the worst feeling in the world is you start working on the project and you can't stand something up. Like the worst thing I hear or say myself is it doesn't work on my machine. Put in chat what is your least favorite thing to hear. Maybe the internet is down. But mine is it doesn't work on my machine. And that's just like a really like frustrating, but like also generally solvable sort of friction when you're trying to work on different projects. So I'm going to show you today what dev containers are, what Codespaces is, and how you can kind of use both of these tools together to hopefully alleviate these situations where you're trying to stand up a project or you're trying to deploy something and just the environment variables aren't working or whatever, and you just can't get it. You're frustrated and you want to go get some coffee or something. So yeah, as Dawn mentioned, questions are great. And if you just put them in chat and Dawn will help kind of manage that. And if you have further questions, I'm on Discord all the time. So please feel free to put questions there or on Mastodon. So I've said a lot of things about dev containers. We've mentioned it. Dawn even showed you some cool stuff in the intro. But what are they? So containers are generally a concept that is kind of permeated a lot of development. Often we think of them as like Docker containers, and they're ways of separating kind of and describing where and how our code runs. So those are great. But a lot of times as a developer, that isn't isn't necessarily the full picture, because you might have, how your application runs, but then there's all of the tooling for doing the deployment or doing the security authentication. even how does your IDE or your editor interact with not working in your local machine, but working in a container? So there is still kind of a lot of things that aren't captured in just like having a Docker container. Don't get me wrong, that's a very good place to start. But dev containers are basically kind of a yes and. It takes the concept of a container for your code in the form of a Docker container and extends that to kind of include a description of how do I need to set up everything that interacts with my container. So the development container, often shortened to dev containers. So this is actually an open source spec that was originally kind of developed in collaboration with some of the VS Code team and GitHub folks. It's been open sourced and is open spec that you can participate in, check out all the repos, file feedback and stuff on the actual spec. And you can find all that at containers.dev. But kind of to give you a flavor of like what do we mean when we say other things in addition to the code container? It's things like, since it did originally kind of spin out of the VS Code project, one thing, it's like all the settings for your VS Code. So maybe you have some extensions that really work well for your project that you want to have set up. Maybe you have color, everything from color themes to setting up environment variables or choosing Python interpreters, setting up that as default. All of those can be set and supported with VS Code. But the cool thing is, because this is an open spec, this has kind of been of interest to a lot of other sorts of developer tools. So there is kind of initial support for dev containers in JetBrains products, in PyCharm. There is a bunch of kind of DevPod, DevBox sorts of companies that will like run development environments in the cloud for you that are also adopting this spec. So it really kind of starts, I work with a lot of folks. I use VS Code. It's my favorite IDE. I've been using it for a long time. But I work with folks who PyCharm is their favorite place to be. And so it's really, there can be friction between, like how I have my IDE set up. I'm working with somebody who's using a different IDE, and maybe our extensions don't like interact with things the same way. Maybe they keep making Git commit conflicts, line endings, things like that. But now, if I am able to configure a dev container, that configuration can apply to both places. So we can have the same experience with our project, contributing and developing and deploying, no matter kind of what our preference for where we develop is. So as I kind of mentioned, the big local editor sort of experience is mainly in VS Code and kind of in progress with JetBrains, but you can use them locally. So if I have Docker on my machine, I can basically install the dev containers extension in VS Code. And if my project has one of these dev container configs, which I'll show you how relatively simple they can be, I can work locally, and my whole project is nicely isolated with all the benefits that Docker generally provides, or the kind of concept of containerization provides. But if I'm working with somebody that also has Docker on their machine, I know that, and VS Code, I know that they can have the same experience without having to play, well, what extensions do you have installed, or how does this work? But if, say, my laptop isn't happy with me today or something, and I'm just having a lot of trouble running things locally, I can do things in Codespaces. So we'll talk a bit about this service, but it's a GitHub hosted version of a container VS Code editor, so that all you need is a browser to be working on your projects. And Pretty much, I do almost. I would say most of my development now is actually in Codespaces, because I can have then different machines I'm working on that have different hardware than even my laptop. And as I showed with the logos on the previous slide, other cloud hosting services like DevPod, DevBox sorts of things also can interpret these configuration the dev container files. And if it's a setting or something that is relevant for those platforms, they can interpret it. So just to kind of give you an idea of what do I mean when I say a dev container file.
Quick question, Sarah,
Oh yeah,
from the chat.
definitely.
How can VS Code profiles be downloaded? I saw the Python profile in one of the URLs above.
Oh yeah. So there's I think the way that profile is shared from the website, VS, I think you can render it actually in the browser as a preview. So if you click the link, it actually pulls up like a VS Code window in a browser tab. That's a preview of what that profile has installed in it, the color themes, all kinds of stuff. And then there should be the panel that shows up on the left should give you the option to like check everything, check all, and then add to my VS Code. There should be a button in a panel on the left. If there isn't, I can try and troubleshoot that at the end. But yeah, profiles are also, I have a bit about it at the end, but profiles are also a good way to kind of address having people have the same sort of setup for a project. But that mainly only works if you're all working in VS Code, which does work in most cases. And that is also something that I really like using myself, because then I can have my presentation mode for VS Code. I can have my web development mode for VS Code, things like that. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, please write back.
I think so. That was solid.
Cool. Yeah, I really like the preview that it shows you beforehand, so you're not just like randomly downloading a thing and then opening once it's on your machine, already opening it and then like, well, I guess I didn't like that. Anyway, so coming back to their dev container config files, but they're just JSON files. So at a bare minimum, all it adds to your project, if as you probably reasonably could be as a maintainer, is this a lot of things to maintain, to add? I mean, we're all familiar with another config file, but this one's JSON, so it can be relatively simple. There's three main parts to it. There is the image part, which basically describes the Docker piece of our dev container. You can specify a Docker file. You can specify either via having a Docker file in your repo, or you can just point to, there's all kinds of actually also dev container templates, which point to pre-built Docker images for, say, like Python development or Go development, things like that. So you can kind of start with templates. You can have your own Docker file, or you can even have a Docker Compose file. So there's some really great examples across some of the Azure samples and docs on Microsoft Learn that have pretty complicated, multi-part, service Azure deployments that you can actually spin up locally, with a Postgres server, with different front ends and sorts of things, all with that Docker Compose, all either locally or deploying to Azure from this dev container. The second main part of dev container files are features. So those are kind of like an easy way if you need to add something on to your Docker file or what describes where your code runs. This is very helpful if you're starting with like a template. So like sometimes I do Python and Rust development. So I might start with a Python like default template for my dev container, and then I'll add on the Rust SDK as a feature. So that's literally just kind of one line. There's a great community. All these features are basically contributed to the dev project, you can look at all of the source, but they're basically also little Docker files that build a piece and then add on. So it's great if you need to, like, say, add the Azure CLI to your project. You just add a line, and then when you spin up your dev container, it has the Azure CLI set up, or AZD, or whatever other tooling you need. Sometimes this can slow down your launch build times, but I mean, you would have to, if you needed it, you would have to install it anyway, and you can mitigate some of the slowdown by doing pre-builds for stuff. So we'll talk about that later. And the last piece of dev container files are the kind of settings component. So these are keyed to the different platforms. So like you can have a VS Code settings section, you can have a Jet or like a PyCharm settings section, you can have a DevPod settings section. So if there's things that, you know, the different editors, like features that they have or components that they have that you need to set up, you can configure it all that way. So yeah, I have an example here of one of our templates for, so if you wanted to set up a dev container, my kind of default install of choice is Miniconda, since I'm often doing kind of scientific-y sorts of things. So this is my Docker file. It's only technically 4 lines, split out a little bit for readability, but I'm starting from a pre-built dev containers community image for Miniconda. Then I'm adding Mamba to speed up some of my package resolutions and having it look to see if I have my environment file in this, and see if I have an environment file in my project and install it. So, you know, if you have, it's pretty easy to add to existing projects, especially if you do have a container, you know, or have some sort of Docker setup. Maybe you have that for your CI or something like that. You can just point to that file. You don't have to necessarily modify it. But honestly, the templates are great. And there's a great kind of selection exploration. If you have the remote development extension pack installed for Visual Studio Code, it can basically walk you through everything that is in the containers.dev project in your command palette. And it's honestly a pretty nice experience, and it just writes the JSON for you. So you get something ready to go out of the box in probably like 10 seconds. So now that you kind of have an idea a little bit of what a dev container is, let's talk about how we might use them, or kind of in like kind of a active scenario. So I want to work on developing and deploying something to Azure. And it can be managing contributions. I work a lot on open source projects. So, you know, if I even just want to like add a small contribution to something, I would probably have to clone the project, build it, set everything up locally, and try to make sure all tests pass, stuff like that. Usually, I mean, that can be a huge friction point for projects to get contributors. So what I tend to do now, and if you like contributing to open source, a great option you might like to try is actually setting up a dev container when you're, say, working on a bug or something like that. So, you know, here's an example of an issue I wrote for a project where I just, you know, I was trying to run their sample app. It wasn't really working. And I was able to basically make a dev container so that someone else could repro the issue that I was having. We didn't have to play the game of like, you know, can you put the details of your machine, or, you know, what version is this? What version is this? Nope, I've given you the pretty much a complete description of how to reproduce. So all of this works especially well because of GitHub Codespaces. So this is a very fast way to host dev containers in the cloud, and pretty much all GitHub accounts get some free allotment. I think it's around 60 hours right now of compute. So you can, whether if you're walking up to a project and you want to start contributing, you can spin up the project in Codespaces. So I'll show you an example here in just a second, but it's literally just kind of an option when you go to code and getting the setup for your project. But you can use it wherever. Sometimes I have trouble with having too many browser tabs open on my laptop. I don't have enough RAM to run a lot of things with Docker. So I just use a big GPU machine to actually run my code space. And then I can do a lot of like Olama stuff or machine learning sorts of things without like locking up my laptop in the airport. So yeah, here's an example. Like I can choose the size of my machine. You can also choose now even GPU options. But there's also, if your project does have a dev container already committed, you can, if you are going through in your maintainer and you're doing reviews, you can actually just directly from the PR open a code space that has all of the changes on that PR checked out and up to date. So that has been a huge time saver too, because if somebody tags me for review on something, I'm there in basically one click. So that's enough talking about it. Let's actually do it. I am going to look at one of our more popular Azure samples right now for setting up a AI RAG chat bot experience. So if you go to aka.ms/ragchat, I happen to have it open here. So this is the repo. It's Azure Search OpenAI. So there's a bunch of different kind of AI Azure components that are combined here. It kind of looks like, you can see it gives you an interface like this. But if you wanted to work on developing this, and I wanted to deploy it, AZD is a great tool, and we have an AZD template set up for this project. So you could deploy it with AZD, but maybe I can't get this working locally on my machine. I would go here, and you can see I have, this would be kind of what you would normally be used to on GitHub. But if you go to the Codespaces option here, I can either just straight up hit the plus here and start my code space, or I can click the triple dots here and actually configure the options. Oops, not configure the options. I meant to click the one above it. New with options. So here, maybe I want to start working on a different branch to start with. You can have multiple dev container configurations per project. So what is really helpful in this sort of scenario is like if you have someone just wants to drive by and try out your project, or just wants to have the quick usable sort of setup, you can have a dev container for that. But you can also have a dev container, say you have this big database sort of combo application, and you have a bunch of additional tooling you need if you're doing dev. You can have a different dev container for that contributor or developer sort of experience for the project. I can choose the region I deploy, and I can choose a bunch of different size options here. So to make sure this goes quickly, I will choose the GPU one. It's not necessary, but I want to make sure demos go quickly. So you can see here, now I have this window that looks like VS Code, but I'm actually just in my browser tab. So this is the same Jay was mentioning earlier. If you go to any GitHub repo and hit the period key, then you get the same sort of web VS Code sort of experience. But I can watch. It's currently trying to connect to and build my code space. So we'll give it a minute. But so we'll come back to the slides. Oops, come back to the slides. But yeah, so if I am working on setting up a new project or wanting to deploy it, I can have all my deploy scripts. I can have all of the authentication and things set up in this dev container, so that I can just share that and hopefully make it easier for people to work with me and contribute to my projects. So you may also want to kind of get spun up on a new project. There's so many of these new cool AI samples that a lot of the folks on my team are working on. that, you know, I feel like every week I need to read a digest or have a live stream to see all the new stuff. Um, so I want to get spun up on something quickly, uh, and I can go to well, we just saw the icons when I deployed that one. You saw it said pre-build ready. So this is something that you can do on Codespaces with your dev containers. You can have all of the Docker steps, everything kind of happen preemptively. You can change the triggers for when it happens. You could do it on a schedule. You could do it only when certain configurations change. But then it's really like kind of the time limit or how long it takes to spin something up is basically just network bandwidth. So downloading the pieces of the image that you need to spin up. It can, as the slide notes here, can potentially add cost just because now you're storing a bunch of effectively images for machines that you've built, but honestly, there's a lot of nice tools and kind of the admin panels for your projects on GitHub, so you can kind of manage that and be in control. So this was actually something we set up for one of my favorite Python projects, NumPy. I worked with the maintainers on NumPy to set up, because they did a lot of sprints where they were trying to scale up a lot of people on their projects. You know, they're really big about encouraging new contributors, and so like with a lot of things, if somebody gets stuck installing or setting up or whatever, it's a really easy way for people to kind of lose interest or get lost. So being able to share for their sprints or any of their like kind of community events a URL to a code space that people can just, if as long as they have internet and a browser, they can actually get started contributing. And it just really has lowered a lot of kind of barriers to learning and entry for folks trying to learn and deploy things. So you can also, if you go to github.com/codespaces, that's kind of your main portal page where you can see all of the code spaces that you've spun up or are using. You also don't have to have a project or a repo tied to them. So maybe you're just like, I have this idea for something, I really want to get started, or you have a friend who's like, I want to start learning Python. I don't have Python installed. I signed up for GitHub though, and so you can then have somebody just spin up a Jupyter notebook or Jupyter Lab. Because the other thing with Codespaces is you don't necessarily have to use a VS Code interface. You can actually use, if you, as a Pythonista, prefer Jupyter notebooks, you can have a Jupyter Lab interface, which I think is really awesome. And somebody had asked about profiles earlier. This was my bonus tip, but profiles are an amazing feature in VS Code that, if short of dev containers, you want to have easy ways to share how you've set up your VS Code for a project. You click on the gear down here, and then you'll see profiles, and you can choose different, like I have ones for presenting where all the font sizes are made bigger and things like that. So yeah, I think we're pretty close to the end. I'm just gonna check back on our.
You're fantastic on time. Like, we're right hitting exactly the end.
I'm gonna go back and try. I have one that I actually already created, so I think I'm just having network fun times. We can see cuddly orbit is. You can see if you create a bunch of different ones already. It should just stand up here. Please. Okay, we'll check it out one more time. But yeah, long story short, dev containers are a really neat extension of what we normally think of as containers for code, that include a lot of the infrastructure development, developer tooling, things around your actual code, which really makes it easier to contribute to new projects, learn new projects by just removing that kind of initial barrier of getting the project working. Then you get to do the fun part, which is you start breaking things. Yeah, so I would encourage you, if you have not whenever you're looking at our samples on Learn and whatnot, a lot of them do have dev containers. If they don't, maybe try contributing one or add them to your favorite project. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. And we had a couple more questions coming in at
Great.
the end
Yeah.
about live share and things like that, but we're low on time. So will you be hanging out in the YouTube chat, or should people reach out to you on Discord, or both? I don't know.
I'll try to answer the questions in YouTube chat real quick as soon as I'm
awesome. We have some questions on live share.
Thanks everybody. Have fun deploying stuff on Azure.